Good evening, everyone. Thank you, as always, so much for joining. And sorry for the slight delay in starting. This will be the last share on Birchat before Pesach. We'll see where we get up to, whether I carry on Birchat after Pesach or whether we start a new theme. But either way, we'll maximum only have another couple of shiurim on Birchat the A to Z of Birchat. So I'm open to suggestions and nominations if there are other topics that people want me to cover next in our series of A to Z of mitzvahs, how and why we do them. Now, last share, which was 2 weeks ago because of Purim in between, I discussed some of the halachas of Birchas Hamazon, and I think we also looked at the issue of mizonus bread. There were a couple of things I was asked to finish off about, which I touched upon, but perhaps didn't give sufficient attention to. So one question I was asked was about the measure of amount of bread that one needs to eat in order to be obligated in the obligation, the chiyuv of Birchas Hamazon, which is a kazayis. And I try to make a kazayis understandable in practical terms, which is that it's about a quarter to a third of a slice of bread. It's about 8 grams or something like that. Now, there is another issue over here, which is how quickly does one have to eat the bread? And without going into all the technical details, there's a concept of terch gedei achilas pras. One has to eat it in a certain speed, which is about 3 to 4 minutes. So not a difficult speed to eat a small piece of bread. And one has to ensure that one has eaten that quantity within that time in order to be obligated in Birchas Hamazon. Now, if you eat less than that, you're not obligated in benching, unless one is satiated, if you're full and satisfied from the meal, having eaten other foods along with bread. And in this case, one ends up with a sofek, a doubt whether one's obligated in Birchas Hamazon. And this is a sofek in a potential Torah obligation. The pasuk says, "V'achalta v'savarta." The obligation, the mitzvah, to eat and to bench is once you have eaten, v'achalta, you've eaten, v'savarta, and you have satiated yourself. So in this situation, you've eaten too slowly for it to qualify as achila, but you have achieved satiation. And in that case, it's unclear whether one should bench or not. So ideally, one should make sure that one specifically eats a kazayis of bread within 3 minutes in order to obligate oneself to bench. If you're unable to do so, you really are full and you're unable to do so, then you don't have to bench. However, you should make sure that you say bracha acharona, the after bracha, on the other foods you've eaten in the meal. So this would be an interesting situation in which, let's say you have a bread meal. That means to say you wash, you eat maybe even a significant amount of bread, but not within the time frame required. And you also have meat and potatoes and other things. So at the end of the meal, you wouldn't bench, even though you were satiated, because you haven't eaten, because you didn't eat the sufficient quantity of bread within the time period of 3 or 4 minutes. Nonetheless, one would then have to say bracha acharona b'orei nefashos on the meat and potatoes or vegetables that have been eaten. So that finishes off one point that I touched upon last share, but didn't delve into sufficiently. The other point I was asked to speak about was the issue of women and Zimmerman. So in the last share, I mentioned the debate around the obligation, chiyuv of women in Birchas Hamazon. Women are definitely included in the mitzvah, definitely can do the mitzvah, are definitely obligated midrabanan, but whether there's a Torah obligation or not depends on how we understand the requirements mentioned, Eretz Yisrael, Bris, and Torah in the second bracha. We saw the second bracha says is based on v'achalta v'savarta. You should eat and be satiated. To be rachta, thank Hashem for the food, give a bracha on the food. Ala oretz, on the land of Israel. So dependent on the debate around women and their relationship to Eretz Yisrael, whether they have a chelek, a portion of Eretz Yisrael, whether bris refers to generic covenant or the specific covenant of the bris milah, Torah. Depending on that will be the controversy around whether they're obligated, whether the lady is obligated in Torah law to do Birchas Hamazon. What's the story around Zimmerman? So Zimmerman is the bracha, the mezuzah that we say before we bench. It's a very interesting bracha, very unusual. It's unique amongst most other mitzvahs and brachas, where we add an extra bracha when there are 3 or more men together who are benching, and this is called Zimmerman, an invitation. It's an extra preparation and merging together of those who have eaten in order to bench together. And the Gemara derives this from a couple of psukim which share the commonality that if three people praise Hashem together, there ought to be a joining in so doing. So they bring the pasuk, Hishem Hashem Ekra, if I call in the name of Hashem, Havu Godel Elokeinu, then plural should bring greatness, ascribe greatness to Hashem. So if I call in the name of Hashem, me, then the plural, another two people, should ascribe greatness to Hashem. So when there's three of us there, together we should praise Hashem. Or another pasuk which expresses a similar idea, a pasuk familiar to us from when we take out the Sefer Torah, Gadlu Hashem Iti. Praise, give greatness, ascribe greatness to Hashem together with me. In other words, it's in the plural. I'm speaking to two people, and I say, join together with me to give praise to Hashem, greatness to Hashem. And together we will elevate His name. So these pasukim indicate there's an idea of three people together praising Hashem, and because Birchat Hamazon is the only bracha in Torah law, brachas are said often by us, but all other brachas are rabbinic, or a reason. It makes sense that we should svara, it makes sense that we should give praise to Hashem and ask permission before we eat, but only benching Birchas Hamazon is a Torah obligation, a Torah bracha. Therefore, Chazal understood this is the time when we come together to give praise to Hashem, and therefore if there are three of us, it should be done in a special, together way. So this is the concept of Zimmerman, in which one person leads the Zimmerman. The literal meaning of the word Zimmerman is the Zamen, to invite. He invites the others to respond, Rabbi Sayin Varech, and then we do this triple-parted bracha, Yehi Shem Hashem Mevorach Me'at Me'at Olom, etc., in which we praise Hashem together, and therefore fulfill this concept of Zimmerman being done jointly. So this is the background to the concept of Zimmerman, a very unusual halachic idea of introducing a mitzvah with a unified praise. Now, what is the nature of the relationship of women to Zimmerman? So we've already discussed women with benching. The Mishnah in Brachas seems to say that women are not counted in the three of Zimmerman. But then the Gemara mentions a second source, which says that ladies who eat by themselves do invite each other, which is a way of saying Zimmerman. They do Zimmerman when they are eating together. So the majority of Rishonim assume that one woman wouldn't join two men to form a Zimmerman. That's the assumption that most Rishonim make, though there are exceptions. There is one opinion, the opinion of that the Mordechai brings, the Maharami Rottenberg brings from Germany, from North France, that a woman does join and make up a Zimmerman of three. However, the majority opinion precludes a woman from joining men in a Zimmerman. Now, interestingly, the Gemara doesn't give an explanation. The Gemara doesn't explain why this should be the case. So there's a number of suggestions put forward. One suggestion put forward is that since the nature of the obligation of men and women in Birchas Hamazon differ, men are obligated min Torah, women are obligated rabbinically, as we've discussed, according to some opinions. That's why they can't join together as a Zimmerman. Another explanation given is, according to those who think the text of Birchas Hamazon differs. I mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago, and I recalled it briefly today also, that in Birchas Hamazon we mention the bris, the covenant, we mention Eretz Yisrael, and according to Rashi at least, this is referring to bris milah, and therefore women would say, in Rashi's opinion, a slightly different text of benching possibly, and according to that opinion, maybe that would be a reason why women don't join in Zimmerman. Again, this wouldn't be applicable Halacha, because we don't paskin like that, we paskin that women say a full text of Birchas Hamazon. Finally, some Rishonim suggest that this is linked to another aspect the Gemara talks about, the concept of pritzus. A meal is a together shared experience, and Chazal instituted various things to remind us when we're in a meal, a mixed meal, to ensure that we remember standards. We don't slip in the enjoyable shared experience of eating together and forget the boundaries of appropriate behavior and sneers. And therefore it may be possible that the reason there isn't a Zimmerman is to sort of remind us, no, we don't come together in that way to bench, because we need to remember that there are always appropriate boundaries when the genders mix. According to this opinion, interestingly, it may be that if a family eat together, so it's not a mixed gathering of random, unrelated men and ladies, it's not just a social gathering, but it's even, but it's rather within the family setting, a husband and wife who are eating together, or a family with siblings, then it's possible, since this reason wouldn't apply, in which case, within a family context, a zimun would take place, even in a mixed group. And the Pri Megadim puts this forward as a possible suggestion. Halacha, the Shulchan Aruch just says this as a general rule, that ladies can form a zimun for themselves, but we don't form a mixed zimun in which the three are made up of men and ladies. So this is the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, and this is the generally accepted Pesach. There were dissenting opinions over time, but this is the how the Shulchan Aruch concludes. Now, the Shulchan Aruch also adds in that when the women who make a zimun, he uses the language of noshim mezamnos la'atzmam, ladies can make their own zimun, reshus, and this is not an obligation, but something voluntary. Now, again, it's not clear why this should be the case. Why should women not be obligated in zimun when they are eating together? I understand we don't do a joint zimun, a mixed zimun, but why is there no obligation to do a separate zimun? So no one actually knows clearly the answer. It's possible that this is because ladies might have been busy with household duties, and therefore for them to have to form a zimun, when the possibility, the obligation rather, of forming a zimun means that one can't leave the table at any time, one has to wait till everyone else is ready to bench, one has to bench together, and therefore this may have been seen as some form of time-bound mitzvah, and therefore an obligation that wasn't imposed on ladies. This is one possibility. The other possibility that Mishnah Berurah discusses, this may have reflected historical circumstances in which, sadly, in the past, ladies were often illiterate, and therefore they were unable to do zimun, and therefore Chazal didn't want to make it as an obligation in order not to make this difficult. And over the years, there's been discussion amongst the poskim about what the standard practice was. The Ben Ish Chai, who records the practice in the Sephardi world, says it's definitely appropriate if women eat by themselves, they should do a zimun. In East Europe, there were different minhagim about ladies doing zimun by themselves. So there's a number of different practices as to whether this is something that should become a standard or not. But in brief, a mixed zimun, the Shulchan Aruch's conclusion is we don't do. However, a separate zimun, which is only of ladies, is certainly something one can do. Whether it should be seen as a quasi-obligation and the right thing to do, or it's just a voluntary thing, as I say, remains a machlokas. Now, what happens if you have the opposite scenario? You have three men, and the three men decide to do a zimun. You have three ladies, and the three ladies decide to do a zimun, and you have a couple of men there at the meal also. How should one practice in this case? So Shimon Zalman Oibach, whose yahrzeit I think is this evening, he says that in such a situation, one of the ladies should lead the zimun, because there's no zimun of men, there's only a zimun of ladies, and then the men should answer to the zimun. So it ends up in a situation in which the ladies would lead in that scenario, and the men would answer to them. Similarly, the Shulchan Aruch rules that where you have three men who are making a zimun, then the ladies should answer the zimun along with the men. So this is a summary of zimun for ladies, which I was asked to cover last week because I discussed the obligation 2 weeks ago. I discussed the obligation of Birchat Hamazon, but we didn't really have time to go in depth into the issue of zimun. Let's just try and discuss some other Birchas Hamazon related halachas. There's obviously a wealth out there. I mean, Birchas Hamazon is a phenomenal mitzvah with an enormous number of halachas. I'm not going to have time to go into everything, connected with Birchas Hamazon. I just tried to choose a sample of halachas which I thought were interesting. There is a minhag to remove knives off the table during Birchas Hamazon or to cover them. And the source of this halacha is found in the Yesharim. Two reasons are given. One reason is given by the Shibbolei Halakha. This is an Austrian Rishon who quotes in the name of someone called Rav Simcha. There is a Rav Simcha who was a student of Rashi, who wrote a lot of Rashi's psakim. It doesn't appear that this is that Rav Simcha that's being referenced. And he says that there was a story in which an individual was benching once and got up to the bracha of Uvenei Yerushalayim, in which we request the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And this recalled the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, and this led to such devastation and heartbreak for this individual that they took the knife and they stabbed themselves. And therefore he said the custom is that we remove knives from the table before benching in order not to cause ourselves danger. Now, whilst this seems very far from our practice, perhaps this is the very reason for the minhag. To remind ourselves as kavanah, as we remove the knives, we shouldn't just remove them, but we should use it as a reminder that we're meant to actually concentrate on the words that are being said in Birchas Hamazon, and concentrate on the meaning and genuinely engage with the content of the bracha and the mourning that's inherent in it. The Rekeach, who brings Kabbalistic sources, he bases this on the Gemara in Chagiga, which tells us that our table is considered like a mizbeach of sorts. Now, when you construct the mizbeach, one shouldn't use an iron implement to construct it. An iron implement is the material used for weapons. Weapons are used to shorten life. The mizbeach is there to lengthen life. And therefore, we remove the knife at the end of the meal to remind ourselves that this table shouldn't just be a mundane table where we eat our food, but it's a mizbeach in which food is sacrificed to Hashem. The food is elevated. Just like a korban, a sacrifice, is an offering to Hashem, similarly the food we eat should be perceived as an offering to Hashem. How is it an offering to Hashem? Well, because we're about to bench, and we recognize that this is a gift from Hashem. It's not ours, it doesn't come through our own might and strength, as we discussed in the first week. The concept of Birchas Hamazon is elevating all foods to the status of mon. Just like the mon clearly came down, lechem min hashamayim, as bread from the heavens, so too we're meant to recognize all food comes from Hashem. And also, like a sacrifice, we're meant to recognize we're meant to use it for something productive and purposeful. And therefore, during benching, we remove the knife. Again, it's meant to be a reflection, a meditation. We remove the knife to remind ourselves that this is meant to be a mizbeach of sorts. Now, there may be nafkaminas, there may be distinctions in practical halacha between these two reasons. According to the Rekeach, many suggest that you don't need to remove the knife on Shabbos, because on Shabbos we didn't build the Beis HaMikdash, and the problem with the knife on the Mizbeach is to do with the building of the Mizbeach, and therefore on Shabbos we may not need to remove it. Interestingly, so one could argue in the Shibbolei Halakha, in the reason given because of the Mizbeach. In the other reason, the Shibbolei Halakha reason, it wouldn't seem that there's a difference between Shabbos and weekday, because in both times one could become so sad about Yerushalayim and the loss of the Beis HaMikdash that one would be in danger. Nonetheless, many of the poskim, the Taz and others, bring that on, there's no need to remove a knife on Shabbos, because the joy of Shabbos would stop us feeling such terrible avedas, such terrible sadness and grief over the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. So this is the minhag of removing knives. There's another nafkamin, another distinction, by the way, I should have mentioned, which is what happens if you have a knife not made of plastic, but some other material, sorry, not made of metal, but some other material. So if the reason for removing knives are because they're iron, and an iron knife shouldn't be on the Mizbeach, then one would not have to remove a knife made of another material. However, if the reason for removing a knife is because of sharpness, then one would have to remove a knife even if it's made of another material. This minhag seems to have slipped out of practice, perhaps because our eating knives at tables are generally pretty blunt. A knife that's used for food is fairly blunt, and therefore maybe this is why the minhag has slipped out of practice. But some families still are makbid to still careful in this minhag. And certainly if you have a sharp metal knife on your table, like a challah knife or something of the sort, or a cutting knife, then one should remove it. Normal knives that are part of cutlery, as I said, aren't particularly cut sharp, and therefore maybe the reason wouldn't apply. So there are, in practical terms, a number of variants in Hagim. Some in Hagim remove the knife, continue to remove knives, others don't bother with this, and others remove it on the weekday, but not on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And I guess another distinction between these two reasons would be whether when Imyetz Hashem Mashiach comes, will we have to remove knives then? So if the reason is because of the Mizbeach, then yeah, we'll still need to remove knives. If the reason is because of danger over Avedus, over Yerushalayim in the Beis Mikdash, then Imyetz Hashem, obviously then we won't feel such Avedus, and therefore we won't need to remove knives. Imyetz Hashem, we should all confront this halachic quandary in the very near future. Okay, so this is one halacha I wanted to mention. Another halacha that I'll touch upon very briefly is that one should leave a little bit of bread on the table for Birchas Hamazon. This is based on a Gemara, which in Sanhedrin, which says that one should leave bread on the table as a siman bracha, as a sign of blessing, maybe indicating that one has more than enough, and one isn't eating down to one's last crumb, and one's recognizing that one has plenty. And maybe it's teaching us a Musar idea that one should leave over some food from one's meal rather than consuming everything that's there. This is how one of the Mefarshim, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, understands the Gemara. They're leaving a little bit of food that demonstrates a concept of self-control. So this is a sort of Musar idea behind the idea of leaving a little bit of food behind. The mystical sources, the Zohar, says that Bracha is only found on multiplying things that are already there. If one has nothing, Bracha doesn't generate from that. If one has a little, then out of that more Bracha can emerge. This is arise at the story in Melachim Beis of Elisha, who, when the poor widow approached him for help, he took a very small quantity of oil and he multiplied it. He couldn't provide a multiplicity of oil from nothing. Only Hashem can create yesh me'ayin, creation ex nihilo, something from nothing. But miracles in the world that's already created can increase that which exists, but not create something from nothing. Either way, the Shulchan Aruch paskins this halacha. The Shulchan Aruch says that one should leave a little bit of bread on the table and not clear away the bread. And many people have the minhag that they don't completely clear the table before they bench, or they leave some crumbs on the tablecloth. The Mishnah Berurah, interestingly, gives another explanation of this mitzvah. And he quotes Rashi, who says that the purpose of this mitzvah is to leave food over for the poor. And he says, he brings us in the Mishnah Berurah, that every meal should have an extra portion left over, which one distributes to poor people. So this is how the Mishnah Berurah understands this idea of leaving food over. Now, it may not be practical to actually leave a portion of food over and distribute it to a poor person, but maybe it's appropriate that for us to adopt a similar practice, which is that every meal have a tzedakah box there at the meal and give a small sum of money to tzedakah at the end of the meal before we bench, as a way of indicating that our leftover food we want to give it to tzedakah to go to poor people. So again, many people have this minhag that we leave the crumbs on the table before we bench. And there's several reflections we should engage in this very beautiful minhag. It's a reminder of the bracha from Hashem. It's a reminder of self-control and not demonstrating greed, that we don't finish all the food. And according to the Mishnah Berurah, it's an idea of not just a reminder, but it was meant to be the practice that we actually give leftover food to aniyim, to poor people. If it's not practical to do, then maybe it can be achieved by giving a small sum of money to tzedakah. So those are a couple of halachas around Birchas HaMazon. I'm just looking at the clock and thinking about time. I see we're going to have another share in Mitzvah Hashem on Birchas HaMazon. So I'll continue now and talk about more halachas. And then next share, which will be after Pesach, I'll use the time available to go through the text of Birchas HaMazon and to try and share insight and understanding into the nusach of the brachas, that when we actually read Birchas HaMazon, we can understand better what we are saying. So for now, I'll carry on the halachas of Birchas HaMazon. The first, or the next halacha I want to share, is that normally speaking, Birchas HaMazon covers all the food that's eaten in this bread meal, even food which normally isn't bread. So even the Birchas Hamazon we would think of as the after bracha on bread, the truth is it's the after bracha on nutrition, on nourishment, hazon es ha'olam kulu b'tovo. And therefore any food eaten in the meal also gets covered with Birchas Hamazon. So we wash, we have bread, and then we have meat, and potatoes, and other things, whose after bracha should be very nefashos, other such things. Nonetheless, it is all covered by Birchas Hamazon. Maybe in the meal one will have some wine, and normally the bracha achrona on wine is alagafen. And if you have wine in the middle of a meal where you haven't had wine before the meal, like Kiddush, you would have to say the bracha is shona on wine, both yagafen. Nonetheless, the bracha achrona Birchas Hamazon covers that because hazon es ha'olam is all inclusive. What happens if you eat food before Birchas Hamazon? Can you rely on the fact that you will then wash, then you will have bread, and then you will say Birchas Hamazon, to rely on that for Birchas Hamazon to cover all the food that's going to be subsequently, to cover the food that was eaten before the meal? Now, the truth is we're all familiar with the answer to this question, because on Shabbos, when we say Kiddush, we drink some grape juice or wine. We don't say bracha achrona on the wine or grape juice, but we go straight into our meal, and then at the end we bench. So evidently benching covers the food that is eaten before the meal. However, this is only the case where the food is linked to the meal and part of the meal, even though I've eaten it before washing. So Kiddush is a very good example of that, because the Kiddush is the preparation which allows me to eat the meal, and the essence of Kiddush is that in Kiddush ela b'makom su'udah has to be made as part of the meal, and therefore Kiddush is one link, if you like, between the food eaten before the meal and the meal itself. So to summarize what we've said, food eaten before the meal is also covered by Birchas Hamazon if it is linked to and part of the meal. How can it be linked to and part of the meal? The answer is several links. If it's an hors d'oeuvre, an appetizer, something eaten in order to whet the appetite, in order to then allow you to have the meal itself, so in that case, it's part of the bread meal, and therefore, even though you ate it before you said, before you washed on Hamotzi, nonetheless, it wouldn't have its own bracha acharona. This may be one of the reasons why we don't say bracha acharona on karpas, even though we have it before we have washed on the matzah on Seder night. So if it's linked to the meal as an appetizer, as an hors d'oeuvre, then Birchas Hamazon would cover it even though I ate it before I benched. Similarly, if it's linked to the meal before there's Kiddush, then again, I wouldn't say a bracha acharona. Finally, if it's a substantial filler that I'm having before the meal, meaning it's a bracha of mazonos, since mazonos, as we saw, is a type of bread, we discussed this last week, that cake and biscuits and halachic times are bread. There's just bread that you eat as part of a meal and bread that you don't eat as part of a fixed meal. So if before washing you're eating some mazonos, in a sense that starts the meal already, that's already the bread that you're eating as part of the meal, it just happens to be bread that you don't have motzi on, and therefore you didn't need to wash, and therefore this would automatically again be considered as part of the meal and covered by Birchas Hamazon in the meal, since this is considered the start of the meal. So that's the halacha of Birchas Hamazon covering benching before, covering food eaten before being eaten. What does one do in a situation where one can't remember if one's benched or not? So I mentioned this briefly last week, but I just want to speak about it in a little more detail. We discussed already that Birchas Hamazon is a Torah obligation. It's a chiyuv min haTorah, and therefore, it's a chiyuv min haTorah if you've achieved satiation. And therefore, if you're satiated from a meal and you can't remember whether you benched or not, you should bench because it's a sofek d'oraisa l'chumrah. It's a Torah obligation when you're not sure whether you've fulfilled the obligation, and therefore you should bench. However, if you don't feel satisfied, in other words, you ate more than a kazayis, but you haven't filled yourself, in such a case, the obligation to bench is a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, and therefore one would not need to repeat benching. The poskim suggests that the best solution to do is to remove yourself from the situation of doubt, and there's an easy way to do this, which is say hamotzi. There's no problem saying hamotzi again because you stopped your previous eating. Then eat a kazayis of bread. A kazayis of bread is just half a slice of bread, it's not a lot. And then you can bench. So that would be one solution to remove the situation of doubt. The other one would be if you have someone around you who does have an obligation to bench, then you could ask them to be moit to you, and that would be enough to fulfill your obligation because they are saying the benching for you. Maybe I'll just mention one more set of halachas around Birchas Hamazon, and then actually start using the little bit of time available to begin talking about the nusach of Birchas Hamazon. Just in the time available, I was going to speak about, well, I'll leave it for now, the additions that one says to Birchas Hamazon, but we'll discuss that maybe next week, Yalav Yava and Anonis and so on, but we can talk about that when we look at the text of Birchas Hamazon. So I'll just conclude in terms of halachic aspects by saying that when one benches, this is one of the few times ever in one's life that one really has an opportunity to say a bracha min haTorah, to say a Torah bracha, and therefore one should do so, ensure that one does so in an appropriate way that brings covered to the mitzvah. One should make sure that one says it when one is dressed in a chubad way. It should be one's hands should be clean, and one should be in a respectable position, and so on. It's a bracha that is a bracha min haTorah, and therefore should be said in a mechubad and in a respectful way. I actually didn't speak about this, but maybe I can just add this in since I mentioned about washing hands. Just to mention the concept of mayim achronim. So mayim achronim is mentioned in the Gemara, and this is the idea of after we bench, we should wash our hands with some water, sprinkle some water over one's fingers or hands, and this is the after washing of one's hands. It's called mayim achronim to distinguish from mayim rishonim, the washing of the hands before we eat bread, which is the tzilas adayim. Now, I'm not going to go into all the halachas, other than to say that mayim achronim differs from mayim rishonim. No bracha is made on it. It doesn't have to get poured from a vessel, a utensil. With tzilas adayim, we have to use a keli, poured from a cup. Mayim achronim can be done even from the tap, and it's sufficient just to wash your fingers. You don't need to wash the whole of your hands. Once one's washed mayim achronim, then one would have to start benching straight away. There are those that have different practices. Some people are careful to use a utensil, other people aren't. Many people do not have the minhag to do mayim achronim. My personal family minhag is that we do not do mayim achronim. There are different reasons given for mayim achronim. Maybe an inyan of kedusha and sanctity pre-Birchas Hamazon, in which case the reason would apply even nowadays. But it may be a matter of cleanliness, or as the Gemara says, in order to remove salt from one's hands. In those days, they used to use a very strong salt, melech sodomis, which could burn one if one forgot to wash it off the fingers, and then you touch one's eyes with it or something of the sort. So many have the practice still to do mayim achronim because of the kedusha elements of it, and many follow the poskim that believe that the reason for mayim achronim is because of the cleanliness to the hands, and therefore nowadays, where we don't use the strong salt and a proper meal, we normally use cutlery and so on, this issue of mayim achronim wouldn't apply. But it's certainly Halacha, if one's hands are not clean, one should definitely wash them as a covered for the mitzvah, as an appropriate way of showing covered for the mitzvah. So this concludes what I wanted to say on the halachic aspect of Birchas Hamazon. Before I move on to the text, if anyone wants to ask anything about the halachic section, I'll pause for a second. Otherwise, we'll carry on and we'll talk about the meaning of the text of Birchas Hamazon and try and understand that a little bit better.
Rabbi Zimmerman, can I just ask something?
Yes.
You mentioned that you don't have to, it's part of the meal, the kiddush.
Yes.
And what happens if you have milky for the kiddush? Let's say you have a l'chaim that's got Baileys, don't mention it, but something like that.
Yeah, nonetheless, so if you have kiddush, you're saying where you make kiddush on a different alcohol
or you just make kiddush and it's part, and then you do your mazonot.
Oh, I see.
You then need to bench or whatever.
Right. So you are correct. Kiddush needs to be done in association with a meal. Now, what do we mean by the meal? A meal. We don't mean the main meal, necessarily the main meal of Shabbos. So you can do kiddush and then immediately wash and have your Shabbos Seudah. Or you could do kiddush and then just eat some cake or biscuits. And then that will be the Seudah, the meal upon which you're eating the kiddush. Now, it wouldn't count as one of your 3 obligatory meals, because the first 2 meals of the day, in other words, the morning meal has to be also a bread meal, but it is sufficient to be a meal for kiddush, and therefore that would count as your seudah with respect to kiddush, though not one of your compulsory meals of the day, and then that would be separate from the bread meal that you're eating afterwards. So in that case, you would normally bench on the little kiddush, you would take a break, and then later you would start your proper meal, and that would be sufficient. If you don't do so if you have kiddush, then you have some milky cake or parrot cake for that matter, and then you wash and start your meal, in that case, indeed, you will not need to bench between the two. So that would be the same. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the nusach of Birchas Hamazon. I've only got a few minutes, so maybe I'll just focus on one issue, which is the meaning of the word bracha. It's something I've discussed before, but I think it bears repeating. And for today, that's all I'll comment on in terms of the nusach of the bracha of Birchas Hamazon. And then next week we'll look or after Pesach. Someone just posted actually that I should have spoken about desserts, brachas on desserts. Okay, someone has reminded me that there's another halacha I should speak about. So I'll speak about a different halacha. And then I will, we'll start the nusach of Birchas Hamazon next week. So thank you to the anonymous commentator who pointed out that I should speak about another halacha. This is the issue of does one make a bracha on dessert, on afters? So the background to this question is as follows. The bracha rishona, the first bracha that we say on food, is not said on any food eaten during the meal, because food eaten during the meal is all subsumed into the eating of bread. So I eat bread, and then everything else I have is either an accompaniment to the bread, or it's a co-worker with the bread. The point of bread is to act as a filler, and I eat other things, potatoes and chicken and salads, in order also to fill myself up. And therefore, I do not make a full bracha on any of these foods. However, what happens if I have food in the meal where the intention of the food is not as a filler, but for something else? Would I then need to make a full bracha on the food? And the answer is yes, I would need to. And this indeed was the classic halacha about afters eaten at the end of the meal, the dessert. If you look in the classic poskim, 100 years back and going back in time, they're very clear. We have at the end of the meal a small sweetener, a sweet at the end of the meal, and one needs to make a full bracha on this. So if you have a little bit of a fruit as a sweetener, you'd need to make eights on it. Benching would cover it afterwards, because benching is hazon, is on all food that is eaten. But since it's not eaten as a filler, as part of the core role of a bread meal, which is to fill one, but merely as a sweetener, one wouldn't need to make a bracha rishon. One would need to make a bracha rishon on this. It would not be covered by the bracha of hamotzi. So just to summarize, Birchas Hamazon, as we discussed, always covers all foods eaten in the meal, and even covers food eaten before the meal, before the bread, if it's part of the meal, as we discussed, if it's kiddush or the like. However, the hamotzi only covers the pre-bracha, the fore bracha said on the food, when the food is eaten as part of the core role of the meal, in other words, as a filler, not when it's afterwards, which is just a sweetener. So say the classic poskim. Now, it is clear to me that the situation has significantly changed nowadays, and food eaten as afters in a meal is also eaten as part of the filler of the meal. In other words, it's become a course of the meal. That doesn't mean to say we always have afters. Obviously, we often don't have afters in meals. but afters has become a regular enough feature of a meal that it is considered just another course of the meal. And for that reason, by the way, we have, relatively speaking, large quantities of afters. A portion of food is served. Someone gets a piece of cake or a scoop of ice cream and so on. It's a proper portion of food that is served. And therefore, it seems that our eating habits have changed. People save room for afters. If you get given just a tiny after at the end, a mint, just to freshen your mouth, then indeed you could argue this is being eaten as a sweetener, it's not eaten as a filler, and therefore it's not part of the meal, the core part of the meal. But in a meal where afters is served as a substantial portion, it's like a piece of cake or it's a whole scoop of ice cream, that means to say that we are having this as a filler, we're seeing this as an additional course to the meal, in which case it would not be appropriate to say a bracha even on afters. Now, I have to tell you, this is very clear in the poskim that eating habits have changed. In fact, the Mishnah Berurah himself, it is recorded that this changed. The Mishnah Berurah, when he wrote the Mishnah Berurah earlier in his life, writes that one says a bracha on afters, and there's an oral tradition that near the end of his life, when fashion's eating style changed, the Mishnah Berurah changed his mind and believed you do not need to make a bracha. In fact, more than that, the Mishnah Berurah says if you have a raw vegetable salad in the middle of the meal, a cucumber salad in the middle of the meal, you would have to make a bracha on this, because who has salads in the middle of the meal? That's not eaten as a filler, it's obviously eaten just as something else, to freshen your mouth or something like that. And therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says if you have raw vegetables in the middle of the meal, you make a bracha on that. Now, no one does that nowadays because our eating habits have changed, and we've come to an awareness that it is healthy to have raw vegetables, and this is part of the food that we enjoy and that we want to eat, and we wish to bring ourselves nutrition from. And therefore, it's appropriate to say the bracha acharona, a bracha. It's not appropriate to say bracha rishona on vegetables eaten in the middle of the meal. And similarly, in my view, one doesn't say a bracha rishona on afters because this has become a substantial part of the meal. I will mention that even those that disagree with this and think you do say a bracha rishona on afters, do not do so if you have cake or something else, which is mazonos, because that certainly is a bread-like substance, as we've discussed, and then you wouldn't make a bracha on it, because you already said hamotzi. The only nafkamina, the only difference whether you make a bracha on them afters or not, would be if you have something like ice cream, which is charcoal, or fruit, which is ha'etz, or strawberries, which are ha'adama. But if you have cake or biscuits or the like, you definitely do not make a bracha rishona on it. However, as I said, in my view, even fruit and ice cream and the like, no bracha should be said, because our eating habits have changed, and this has become a core part of the meal. We eat it as a filler, and therefore no bracha should be said. So I'll stop here for today with the conclusion of halachas. I wish you all a good Pesach. If I don't, those of you that only come to this share, I will be giving my pre-Pesach share next Wednesday, and but this Lahavah series of shiurim has come to an end now till after Pesach. But I look forward to resuming after Pesach when we will finally get there. B'li neder, I commit to that, and we'll actually look inside at the text, and we'll work through the text of Birchat and hopefully come to some understanding around that. As always, thank you so much for joining, and I'll just stay on for a minute or two in case there are any questions that people want to ask.